Lonely rancher for years, until Apache girl said, "Let me feel you tonight." Vertical bar Best Wild West stories. Samuel Garrett had spent most of his life working the land, and over the years he had become accustomed to the quiet, unchanging rhythm of his solitary existence. His ranch sat in the dry, dusty heart of New Mexico, surrounded by miles of empty desert. He had inherited the land from his father, a man who had also lived alone, and Samuel had never seen a reason to leave. Life on the ranch was tough, but it was all Samuel knew. The sun burned fiercely in the sky, and the wind whipped through the dry plains. Most days, Samuel worked from dawn until dusk, mending fences, caring for his cattle, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. He didn't mind the solitude. In fact, he had grown used to it. After all, it wasn't like he had anyone to share his life with. He had once been married, but that had ended years ago. His wife had left him, unable to handle the isolation of ranch life. He had a few friends, but none who lived nearby. Samuel's life was simple. Wake up, work hard, eat his meals alone, and go to bed early. The quiet nights were the hardest part. Sometimes, when the winds howled and the stars stretched endlessly above him, he would remember the sound of laughter he hadn't heard in years. He missed it, but it was a longing he buried deep inside. There was no use in thinking about things that could never be again. It was during one of these long, quiet nights that Samuel heard the sound of hooves approaching his cabin. At first he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him, but then the sound grew louder, closer. He stood from his chair by the fire and moved toward the window. There, through the dust and the shadows, he saw her. A woman on horseback, riding through the storm. She was alone, and the horse looked tired, its steps uneven as it trotted towards the ranch house. Samuel couldn't believe his eyes. People didn't just wander through these parts. The desert was unforgiving, and most who ventured out here had a purpose. But this woman, she seemed lost. He didn't know what made him step outside, but before he knew it, he was standing in front of the cabin, squinting into the wind. The woman was getting closer, her face barely visible beneath the dark hood of her cloak. Her horse stumbled, and she nearly fell off. Samuel moved quickly, his boots kicking up dust as he crossed the yard toward her. When he reached her side, he could see the strain on her face, her eyes wide with exhaustion and pain. "Easy there," he said, gently helping her off the horse before it collapsed to the ground. She was small but strong, and despite the pain she must have been feeling, she didn't cry out. Her dark eyes locked onto his for a moment before she looked away, clearly trying to hide the fact that she was struggling. "What's your name?" Samuel asked, though he already had a sense she wasn't here to share pleasantries. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at the horse and then back at Samuel, as if weighing her options. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Ayanna," she said. "I've come for shelter." Samuel nodded, moving to lead her inside the cabin. "You're welcome to stay, but I need to tend to your horse. It's been through a lot." Ayanna didn't argue. She simply followed him inside, her steps slow and heavy. Samuel helped her sit in a chair near the fire, and when she removed her cloak, he noticed the bloodstains on her clothes. She had been injured, but how badly, he couldn't say. "Let me see that wound," Samuel said, trying not to sound too concerned, but his eyes couldn't help but linger on the blood on her arm, staining the fabric of her shirt. Ayanna hesitated, but finally she rolled up her sleeve. A deep gash ran along her forearm, a wound that had clearly been inflicted recently. "I can stitch it up," Samuel said, pulling out his medical kit. Ayanna nodded, allowing him to clean the wound. She winced as he worked, but didn't make a sound. "Where are you from?" Samuel asked, trying to make conversation. Ayanna paused before responding. "Far from here. The desert can be a lonely place, but I've been traveling for days." "On your own?" Samuel asked. His voice softened as he noticed the weariness in her eyes. He had seen the signs of exhaustion in many faces, but there was something different about hers. There was a quiet strength in her, a resilience that Samuel admired. She nodded slowly. "I've learned to survive." Samuel finished tending to her wound and then made her a plate of food. Ayanna ate in silence, her eyes constantly scanning the room, alert to any sound or movement. Samuel knew that look. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, someone who trusted no one. As the night wore on, Samuel couldn't help but feel the pull of her presence. It had been so long since he'd had someone in the cabin. The loneliness that had defined his life for so many years suddenly felt unbearable. Ayanna didn't speak much, but her quiet strength seemed to fill the space between them.
"You're welcome to stay as long as you need," Samuel said, sitting down across from her.
He wasn't sure why he was saying it. Perhaps it was the storm outside or the memory of his own isolation. Whatever it was, he found himself wanting to offer her something. A moment of peace, if nothing else. Ayanna nodded, her dark eyes meeting his once more. I appreciated. She didn't say anything else, but something in her gaze made Samuel wonder if there was more to her story than she was letting on. It was clear she was hiding something she wasn't ready to share. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Samuel settled back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to the woman in front of him. She was a mystery, a fleeting presence in the vast desert. But for the first time in years, Samuel didn't feel quite so alone. The next few days passed slowly. Samuel had grown used to the quiet rhythm of life on the ranch, but having Ayanna around was a change he hadn't expected. She kept to herself most of the time, but there was a strength in the way she carried herself, an air of mystery that Samuel couldn't ignore. Each morning, he would wake up early as usual to tend to his animals and check the fences. Ayanna would often be sitting near the fire, her back straight and her eyes scanning the horizon. It was clear she had been through something. He could see it in the way she carried herself. She wasn't the kind of person to give up, no matter what life threw at her. But she wasn't eager to share what she had endured, and Samuel didn't press her. He understood that some wounds couldn't be healed with words. The silence between them was comfortable, though. Ayanna didn't seem to mind the quiet of the ranch. Perhaps it reminded her of the isolation she had grown up with. Samuel didn't know much about her past, but there were hints, small details she let slip during their brief conversations. She spoke little of her family or where she had come from, but once, when he had mentioned the land his father had left him, her eyes had darkened. For a moment she looked like she was going to say something, but then she turned away and said nothing. As the days went by, Samuel couldn't help but notice the little things. Ayanna's grace, the way she moved like she was part of the land itself. She didn't seem to care much for luxury, and her needs were simple. She never asked for anything, but sometimes Samuel would catch her looking at the stars for hours at night, as though they were the only ones who understood her. The rancher didn't ask why. He just watched her from a distance, knowing that whatever pain she carried was hers to bear. One afternoon, when Samuel returned from mending a broken fence, he found Ayanna standing near the edge of the property, looking out over the land. She had been quiet for most of the day, and Samuel had almost forgotten she was there. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice breaking the silence. Ayanna turned, startled, as if she hadn't heard him approach. "It is," she said softly, her gaze shifting back to the vast desert stretching before them. "I used to think that the land never cared for anyone. It gives, but it also takes." Samuel wasn't sure what she meant by that, but he could hear the sadness in her voice. It was a kind of sorrow he was familiar with. The land could be harsh, unforgiving, and it had taken much from him over the years, but there was something about the way Ayanna spoke that made him wonder if her pain ran deeper than his own. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Samuel asked, his tone gentle. He knew better than to pry, but something about the way she held herself made him feel like she needed to talk. Ayanna turned to him, her dark eyes full of something, maybe fear, maybe regret, but it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. "I've had to survive," she said quietly, her voice steady. "But survival is different when you're running from something, not just trying to stay alive." Samuel didn't push further. He could tell she wasn't ready to share more, but he could also see that the weight she carried was immense. He had seen it in the eyes of soldiers who had come back from battle, in the faces of people who had lost everything. The evening came, and with it, another quiet meal by the fire. Samuel noticed that Ayanna ate sparingly, as if she didn't want to take more than what was necessary. She never asked for more food, never complained about the conditions of the ranch, despite how humble it was. Samuel couldn't help but admire her. There was strength in her, but it wasn't the kind that screamed for attention. It was the kind that stood tall, silent, and unwavering, even in the face of hardship. As they sat in silence, Samuel caught himself watching her. He had always been a man of few words, but Ayanna's quiet presence seemed to make the silence more comfortable. It wasn't awkward. It was peaceful, in its own way. "I don't mean to pry," Samuel began, breaking the silence, "but I can see you've had a hard life. I don't know what it is you're running from, but if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." Ayanna didn't look at him right away. She seemed to be thinking, her hands folded in her lap. After a moment, she looked up, her eyes soft but distant. "There's nothing to talk about," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's in the past stays there. We can't change it. All we can do is keep moving forward." Samuel nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had lived with his own ghosts, things he couldn't change. But something about Ayanna made him want to protect her, even if she didn't need protection. She was different from the women he had known. She wasn't looking for someone to fix her. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was just surviving. The nights grew colder as the storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Samuel could feel the tension in the air, a kind of anticipation that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Something was coming, but he wasn't sure what. One night as they sat around the fire, Ayanna spoke again, her voice low and almost uncertain. "Do you ever wonder if you're meant for something more?" she asked, her eyes staring into the flames. Samuel didn't answer right away. It was a question that caught him off guard, one that made him think of all the years he had spent alone. "I used to," he said finally, "but I stopped. I think maybe we're meant for what we have right now. Sometimes what we need isn't something grand, it's just peace." Ayanna nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. Maybe, but peace doesn't always come easy. Samuel didn't have an answer for that. He could see the weariness in her, the burden she carried. He knew that the peace she longed for was something she would have to find on her own. But there was something about the way she spoke, the way she carried herself, that made Samuel feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't so alone anymore. As the fire burned low, the silence between them grew comfortable again. Samuel couldn't help but wonder about the path Ayanna had taken to get here, but for now, he didn't press. Some things, he thought, were better left unsaid. The days on the ranch passed in a quiet, almost rhythmic fashion. The work was hard, but Samuel had grown used to it. Ayanna, too, had settled into the routine. She would often accompany him while he worked, staying close but never intruding. Together they cared for the land, tending to the cattle and repairing broken fences. But the silence between them was heavy, almost as if they both knew that something was changing, but neither of them could say what it was. It wasn't just the work that had changed. Something unspoken had begun to grow between them, a bond that neither of them was ready to acknowledge. Samuel could feel it in the way Ayanna looked at him sometimes, the brief moments when their eyes would meet, and then quickly look away, as if they both shared a secret they weren't ready to confront. One afternoon, as Samuel was repairing the roof of the barn, he noticed Ayanna standing by the fence, watching him. He didn't know why, but the sight of her standing there, so still and calm, made his heart race. There was something about her, something that pulled at him, made him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. He had tried to push the feeling aside, telling himself that it was nothing more than the isolation of ranch life, but it was more than that. He wasn't sure if it was the way she held herself, or the way she carried the weight of her past with such quiet strength. But Samuel found himself thinking about her more and more. He finished his work and climbed down from the roof. Ayanna didn't move, still standing by the fence, her eyes fixed on the horizon. For a moment, Samuel watched her from a distance, unsure of what to do or say. There was something about the stillness in the air that made him hesitate. He had never been good with words, especially when it came to matters of the heart, but for some reason he felt like he needed to say something. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost unsure. Ayanna didn't answer immediately. She turned toward him slowly, her dark eyes searching his face, as if looking for something that Samuel couldn't quite understand. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, her expression softening. "I'm fine," she said finally, her voice low. "Just thinking." "About what?" Samuel asked, stepping closer to her. The distance between them felt both far and near at the same time, like a thin line that neither of them was ready to cross. Ayanna hesitated, looking out over the land again. "About where I've been and where I'm going," Samuel nodded, understanding more than she knew. He had been in her shoes once, wondering if the path he had chosen was the right one, wondering if he was running from something or heading toward something. He had always been a man of the land, but deep down, he knew there was more to life than this lonely existence. "I used to think that running away would solve everything," Ayanna continued, her voice distant, as if she were speaking to herself. "But the more I run, the more I realize I can never escape what's inside me." Samuel listened quietly, his heart heavy with empathy. He could sense the pain in her words, the truth she wasn't ready to fully share. He didn't push her to explain, but something told him that the journey she had been on was far more difficult than he could imagine. "I understand," Samuel said after a moment. "Sometimes the things we carry are heavier than the world we live in. But you don't have to carry them alone." Ayanna looked at him then, her gaze soft but intense. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that Samuel hadn't seen before. For a brief moment he saw the walls she had built around herself begin to crack, just enough to let him in. "Maybe," she said, almost whispering, "but I'm not sure I know how to let anyone in." Samuel felt a pang of sadness in his chest. He had seen this before. People who had closed themselves off, people who had been hurt so many times that they couldn't trust anymore. He didn't know what had happened to Ayanna, but he knew that it was something that had shaped her into the woman she was today. "I don't expect you to," Samuel said gently, "but I'm here. If you ever need someone to talk to, or just someone to be with." Ayanna didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable. Samuel didn't push. He didn't need to. He knew that in time she would come to him if she wanted to. For now, he would let her be. The evening came quickly, and with it the familiar quiet of the ranch. Ayanna and Samuel sat together by the fire, the warmth of the flames a comforting presence between them. The tension that had been hanging in the air seemed to dissipate, replaced by a calm that Samuel hadn't felt in a long time. As they sat in silence, Ayanna spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know, when I first came here, I didn't expect anything. I thought I'd just find a place to rest, to heal. But I found something more." Samuel looked at her, his heart racing in his chest. "What do you mean?" Ayanna turned toward him, her eyes searching his face. "I didn't expect to find someone who understood, who didn't want anything from me, just someone who sees me for who I am." Samuel felt his heart beat faster. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of the crackling fire and the beating of his own heart. He didn't know what it meant, but he could feel the pull between them, the unspoken connection that had been building over the past few days. Ayanna stood slowly, her body moving with a grace that took Samuel's breath away. She walked toward the edge of the firelight, her silhouette dark against the fading light of the evening. "Thank you," she said quietly, without turning to face him, "for everything." Samuel stood as well, moving toward her. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice steady. "You're welcome here. Always." Ayanna turned then, and for the first time Samuel saw something in her eyes that made his heart ache. It was a look of vulnerability, of trust, but also of something deeper, something neither of them was ready to face. "I'm not ready yet," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, "but I will be." Samuel nodded, his heart heavy with understanding. He didn't know what the future held for them, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it. The days after their conversation by the fire felt different. There was a quiet shift between Samuel and Ayanna, something that neither of them could put into words, but both felt deep down. The tension that had hung between them for so long had begun to ease. Ayanna was no longer just the mysterious woman who had arrived at his doorstep. She had become something more, a presence, a companion, someone whose company he found himself craving more and more. Samuel still didn't know much about her past, and Ayanna still kept her distance when it came to certain things, but there was an unspoken understanding between them now. They didn't need to speak to know what the other was thinking. Sometimes, when their hands brushed while working, it felt like the entire world paused, and for that brief moment, they were the only two people in existence. But they said nothing. There were no words for what they felt. It was late one afternoon when Ayanna finally spoke again, her voice low and hesitant as she approached Samuel while he worked on fixing the fence. "I've been thinking," she began, her words careful, as though she were testing the waters. Samuel paused his work, wiping the sweat from his brow. "About what?" he asked, not knowing where this conversation might go, but curious nonetheless. Ayanna looked out over the land, her gaze distant. The wind blew her hair gently across her face, but she didn't seem to notice. "About everything," she said. "About why I'm here. About why I found you." Samuel didn't say anything at first. He was afraid if he spoke, he might ruin the moment, or worse, say the wrong thing. But inside, his heart raced. He had been waiting for this, waiting for her to open up, to let him in. "You're running from something," Samuel said finally, his voice soft, understanding. "I don't know what it is, but I can see it in you. I don't want to push you to tell me, but I want you to know. You don't have to be alone anymore." Ayanna didn't look at him, but she didn't look away either. "I've been alone for a long time," she said quietly. "I've gotten used to it. I don't know how to be anything else," Samuel nodded. He understood that more than she could know. He too had spent many years alone, buried in the work of the ranch, and trying to ignore the loneliness that settled deep within his chest. But there was something different about Ayanna. There was a rawness to her, a pain that he couldn't ignore. It was the kind of pain that Samuel knew well, and it was the kind of pain that could break a person if they let it. "I don't want to force anything on you," Samuel said, his voice gentle. "But I do want you to know that I'm here, for whatever you need." Ayanna finally turned to face him, and in her eyes Samuel saw something that made his heart skip a beat. There was vulnerability there, but also something stronger, a determination. She didn't need him to fix her. She needed someone who would stand by her side, someone who would understand without asking for more than she could give. For a long moment they just stood there, looking at each other, the distance between them feeling both vast and intimate at the same time. "Samuel," Ayanna said softly, her voice carrying a weight of meaning he hadn't expected. "There's something I need to tell you, but I don't know if I'm ready for it." Samuel didn't know what she was about to say, but he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to reach out, to tell her it was okay, but he knew that this was something she had to do on her own terms. "You don't have to tell me if you're not ready," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." Ayanna took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, Samuel saw her let her guard down. She stepped closer to him, just a few paces, but the change was noticeable. The air between them felt charged now, filled with anticipation, yet still filled with a quiet respect. "Maybe I'm afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of what it would mean to let someone in. I've spent so long keeping people out, keeping myself locked away." "I get that," Samuel said, his voice soft. "But you don't have to do that here, not with me." Ayanna nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. I think I've been running from more than just my past," she said. "I've been running from the idea of letting someone else care for me. But I've realized that maybe I don't have to carry all of this alone." Samuel's heart swelled. In that moment, he knew that this wasn't just about the land, the ranch, or even their shared silence. It was about two people who had found something in each other, something that neither of them had expected but both needed. Without another word, Ayanna took another step toward him, closing the distance that had always been there between them. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable or awkward. It was understanding. She didn't have to say anything more. Samuel could feel it in the air, in the way they stood there, together but not quite touching. They both needed time, needed space to process what was happening, but the connection between them was undeniable. As the day faded into evening, the ranch seemed to grow quieter. The sounds of the world, wind, birds, the soft hum of the cattle in the distance, blended into the background. Samuel and Ayanna stood together in the fading light, not saying a word but knowing that something had shifted. Ayanna turned to him, her face soft, her eyes filled with something that felt almost like hope. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling ever so slightly, "for not pushing me, for giving me space." Samuel smiled gently, his heart full. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're here." They stood there for a while longer, just looking at each other, the stars beginning to appear in the night sky. It wasn't a grand declaration or a sudden burst of passion. It was just two people, two souls, standing together in a world that had once seemed so lonely. They didn't need to explain anything to each other. All that mattered was that, for the first time in a long time, they were no longer alone. As the night settled in around them, Ayanna took a step closer to Samuel, her body language open but still cautious. And in that moment, without either of them speaking another word, they both knew that the future they had been running from was now within their grasp. Together.